Hey guys, welcome to the latest episode of the i5 podcast. I'm here as usual with my co-host Jim.
Hello.
Hey, and today we're going to be talking about something other than British politics. We're going to be talking about the incident that caused a lot of tension internationally that happened when a missile strike basically landed in Poland. Are you ready for this one, Jim?
Yep.
So basically what's happened is what is believed at this time at least to be a Ukrainian missile, as stated by US intelligence services and the Polish government itself, landed in Poland outside the Polish village of Suwałk and killed 2 people. This has caused tension as two citizens of a NATO state were killed, and there were concerns that Article 5 might be triggered. Naturally, at the time, Kerensky claimed it was the Russians and demanded NATO intervention. And, of course, the Russians denied any involvement. While there was this tension, rational heads sought to investigate over jumping to conclusions. It's now been, again, as of time of recording, that it was a Ukrainian anti-missile defense missile that landed in Poland. Bearing in mind the Russians had fired about 90 missiles at the Ukrainians that day, while Zelensky is claiming that Russian troops were coming through Poland in response to the claims that it was a Ukrainian missile. What do you make of it, Jim?
I don't know how to put this into words, but it looks awfully suspicious. So we've been hearing lately that Russia is retreating, So suddenly, since Russia is retreating, we hear that there's missiles coming from Russia. And then the second thing we hear is that these missiles were actually a self-defense against Russia, because Russia apparently was invading through Poland. So how could Russia invade via Poland when they said that it was actually retreating? I don't know, and it seems a bit fishy. I mean,
yeah, especially oh, sorry.
No, please carry on.
Especially with the new focus being on Bakhmut, how the commanders pulled out of Kherson and more forces are being diverted toward Bakhmut, which seems to be the new theater. I mean, it's a big debate on Bakhmut as to why Putin is pushing for this one, which could be a video in itself. We might touch on it this podcast, but there really is a debate on why that's the case. Some people are saying that Bakhmut has a lot of strategic value. Others are saying it's part of an outdated strategy that was relevant before the offensive. But yeah, I'd like to see more evidence of the claims that Russian troops were going through Poland.
That's the thing, though. It's really difficult to get the facts right, because you have many sources of information that claim to be valid, but there's no way to actually verify what's valid or not. And yeah, it's very difficult to get down to the facts.
What's really dangerous as well is Article 5, just to define for the audience. Article 5 is basically attack one of us, attack us all. For NATO, it's if one NATO state is attacked, then the rest of NATO is obligated to declare, to basically defend the NATO state that was attacked. In this case, it would be Poland. So you can see how this would be very tense in terms of starting World War III or escalating out of the Ukrainian theater.
Yeah, and the weird thing is, if supposing that not for some reason, but supposing the Article 5 gets triggered, and there's 2 scenarios here. One scenario, the missiles is Russian, so therefore NATO needs to retaliate against Russia. And the other scenario is that the missiles are actually from Ukraine, because that's the very last thing that I heard. The very last thing that I heard was that apparently the missiles were from Ukraine and they were fired as a self-defense because Russia was invading via Poland, which is, I don't know about the validity of that. But if the missiles are actually from Ukraine, and Article 5 gets triggered, then NATO needs to attack Ukraine. So
yeah. So,
I mean, it's say the least.
It is. And it's kind. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of theories as to what's going on and who's behind it all. But I can see, depending on what theory you follow, as to who is behind. There are people and sides that have a lot to gain from this case.
I mean, what NATO, not what NATO so much, what the intelligence services have claimed and what the Polish government are saying is, first of all, they're saying they don't believe it's a deliberate strike by Russia, and it's most likely that the Ukrainian missile, if it is a Ukrainian missile, has just fallen short, or it's collided with a Russian missile and it's landed over the Polish border. I mean, this is kind of a symptom of, not even a symptom. this was really waiting to happen, especially when you've got missiles being flung from both sides. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a complicated scenario. Firstly, you have what is essentially a border dispute between countries, which has now escalated into Putin not recognizing Ukraine's right to any independence and potentially its right to exist. The Russian echelon attack, with its intention to strike through to Kiev to demolish it, and then have Spetsnaz dance on the rubble and then demilitarize the country, demonstrates this. It didn't work. But what also demonstrates it are the tactics that he's resorted to now, such as Russian artillery targeting civilian cities, destroying energy plants, danger close strikes that damaged a nuclear plant, if unintentional. He's been accused of doing it deliberately, and there are other war crimes. But I just want to say as well, to add another complication, this conflict takes place on a stage that it shares with a globalized community, the European Union, NATO, China and its allies, as well as Russia with its allies. This creates a danger that the war could spill into Europe and then potentially the world, given Ukraine's acting essentially as a buffer zone between Russia and Europe, and being surrounded by NATO states like Poland, which gives the potential of Article 5 triggering, as this missile landing over the Polish border demonstrates. Put it bluntly, it's basically surrounded by European nations and NATO states. You know, even in Vietnam, there was the odd airstrike, well, there was many that went over the Cambodian border. So it is kind of a very dangerous situation, you know, in terms of the globalized political structure that we have, wherein an accidental strike, I mean, would you say it was only a matter of time before something like this happened, before an accidental missile strike or something as innocent as a missile going off course was going to go over a NATO border?
So it's an interesting question. Accidental, I highly doubt it. This is war, right? I have to assume that there is a lot of planning going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
On both sides. So considering that this war has been going for quite a while now, I would assume that ammunition and supplies in general must have some value. So after all this time, that since the war has started, to say that this sort of missile strike was accidental is a bit of a far stretch for.
I mean, it may have been. It's just with the supplies running low for Ukraine, they're getting constant aid from the West, the US, Britain, and arms companies and the like. While with Russia, supplies definitely are running low, and we've seen evidence of it. The one thing that there are arguments to say that Putin was maybe testing the water to see if he could get away with, you know, bombing a NATO state to try and provoke them to see if NATO would respond in force to gauge the reaction. But I'm not so sure. Part of me does think this was just basically a misfire, something as innocent as Ukraine accidentally firing a missile short, just because Putin has actually worked with NATO to some extent to prevent this from escalating into Europe.
I just don't see how it would be a misfire. We're talking about open war, and you do what? A misfire against Poland, which is another NATO country. Well, it would make more sense to me that Ukraine would fire the missile on purpose, so NATO would think that Russia did it, therefore NATO. So it was like an indirect action for Ukraine to make NATO take action against Russia. That's my opinion. That's what I think. Well, of course, I have no concrete evidence on that, but this sort of makes sense to me because I can't see how after 6 months now, is it 6 months down?
Yeah,
the
it's
war,
been going on since March.
Yeah, and suddenly someone decides to misfire the missiles. It might have been someone's like acting with no orders just because he thought of this as a good idea. But even then, there is intent, there's planning. So I don't think it was unintentional. But again, that's my own personal opinion on the matter.
No, fair enough. I do personally think that a missile's just accidentally landed over the border, but there is validity to what you're saying, because I mean, there is reason to the argument. You know, unintentional or not, Zelensky did take advantage of it, claiming the Russians did it. Ukraine's not actually a NATO state yet.
Oh yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, why I believe that is because the strike happened, and with no evidence, with no nothing, Zelensky went out and immediately blamed the Russians without wasting a second. He was like, "Oh yeah, that's Putin." Boom.
I mean, while the Russians did stay silent and basically just said it wasn't us. Evidently, the Russians not wanting to escalate it obviously any escalation would, well, I don't think any escalation would work in the world's favor at all, but Zelensky, does want more NATO support. He's made it clear over the past
Yeah.
6 months, asked for, just to go into that actual argument of, we'll go into a little bit of the argument that we had later, a little bit of the podcast that we're going to do a bit later, which is keeping it localized to a flashpoint conflict in Ukraine, and keeping it within the context of border dispute between two countries in which one invades another, and the invasion, as brutal as it is, stays specific to that one country. It stays in that one specific theatre of war over a greater theatre of war, because whenever wars go on, obviously people can make a lot of money from it. But there is a lot of, not so much cooperation, but reluctance on the side of NATO to escalate too much, to basically give the Ukraine capabilities that they didn't have before. The majority of the aid is coming in the form of rounds for rounds for guns, things like that, transport vehicles. They're being given drones, cybersecurity, care packages of money. I think they're now being given anti-missile defenses as well. So is Poland, actually. But there's been a lot of reluctance to give them. We'll go into a lot more detail about this later on in the podcast, but there's been a lot of reluctance to give them MLRs.
What is an MLR? Missile launcher.
Yeah. So the MLRs, basically long-range missile launchers that can fire up to 185 miles. Zelensky wanted them, but Biden basically said no, because they would give the Ukrainians a capability that they didn't have before, and that would be to fire missiles from their own border or from their own side of the border into Russia.
I'm sure nothing would go bad. I mean, hell, you see this incident today. Imagine if they had the long-range missiles.
Oh God, I know.
By accident.
I mean, I get what you're saying. I still think it was a bit of an accident that it went into Poland, but I think Zelensky did take advantage of it a bit. But another one as well, the Polish, at the time of the beginning of the war, and I remember this one, the Polish also offered 28 MiG-29 fighter jets, because a big thing was Zelensky and the Ukrainian military wanted the airspace made secure. But NATO didn't want to go that far. They didn't want to go in to secure the airspace. They didn't want tactical dogfighting. With NATO planes versus Russian planes. They didn't want that kind of direct conflict. And the Polish were willing to give them 28 MiG-29 fighter jets, but they wanted Biden to give it to Zelensky on their behalf. But again, that was seen as a hell of an escalation, because when you start giving, as I said before, the support through vehicles and weapons, a lot of people are saying that the ground war would have been as effective from the Ukrainian side if they hadn't have received those, because the Ukrainians just seem to be a very good army. They were very experienced before this, and they were somewhat ready, so they've been able to respond against really what are subpar, poorly equipped Russian troops. NATO haven't given them capabilities that they didn't already have. So the danger would be, if you started giving them long-range missile launchers like the MLRs, if you started giving them things like lots of airplanes, there's a danger that Russia may perceive that, or choose to interpret that as using Ukraine as a proxy state to attack Russia on NATO's behalf, which could lead to serious escalations.
Yeah.
And like I said, I know we're disagreeing on this, but I fully get where you're coming from. That Zelensky might want to raise the stakes to get that necessary support that he has asked for in the past.
Yeah, the other thing is, I want to get back to what you said before about the possibility that Putin might be trying, to see what he can get away with. I think he has already done this, considering with what he did in regards to the gas pipes.
Yeah.
So he has no reason to go a step further to try it with the missiles.
I mean, he's basically been holding Europe hostage with gas anyway. So he's showing that he's not afraid to provoke. I don't think that he's stupid enough to trigger Article 5 in NATO.
No. No one wants that. And it's not just people in the EU, but it's like also people outside of the EU. No one wants that. Because the economic consequences of something like that happening are, I think, massive. Too massive to even, imagine.
I've heard some people try and argue because he attacked Georgia when it joined NATO, it carries the same principle as the Ukrainian conflict, but I don't think that's the case. Georgia was a tiny nation, and Putin's echelon attack wave allowed him to just immediately demilitarize it before anyone could even get an Air Force jet in there. It completely took everybody by surprise that he did it, and NATO really just let it go. He tried the same thing in Ukraine. The idea was the echelons, as said earlier, would go to Kyiv and demilitarize it, which hasn't worked. He'll play games with the gas, but I like I said, I don't think he's dumb enough to trigger Article 5. I genuinely don't think anyone wants World War III.
No, exactly.
Which is, when the missile strike happened, I remember speaking to someone saying that they were really nervous and they were scared, but I honestly wasn't, because I knew that no one would jump to conclusions about this. and they would investigate it. And regardless of what's happened, I kind of believe they would choose to interpret or just flat out say that it's not something that would warrant Article 5 being triggered because of the reluctance to actually do it. This entire conflict, in terms of the foreign intervention in this conflict, it's all about not forcing a reaction from the opponent between NATO and the Russians.
Yeah, I can see that.
But it does highlight a real danger that World War III could trigger. Adding to that, the war in Ukraine is brutal, as we've already discussed. Civilians are getting killed. The infrastructure to Ukraine is getting completely battered. I mean, even if they push the Russians out, it's going to take them a decade to rebuild at least. And it'll require a lot of aid from NATO and the EU to help them do it. So it would be in everyone's best interest for this war to stop. I mean, you would think that peace between the two and coexistence would be the best thing for everybody, as it's unknown what would happen if, say, Russia collapsed as a result of this war, or a power vacuum left behind should Putin be removed. People are saying that the leader of the Wagner mercenaries are trying to go for it.
The whole situation in the world, and I'm talking about everything, tensions between different countries, the economy, everything. You can imagine it like a very poorly structured Jenga tower, where it's so fragile, where if you remove even a small piece, the whole thing will crumble. I think in the case where, say, Russia just leaves a power in vacuum for whatever reason, that would mean the collapse of everything. So ideally, we would want this sort of war to just be de-escalated and leave it as it be.
Yeah.
So that everyone could heal from it, the economy would heal from it, and I mean the global economy, and start getting things back on track. But realistically speaking, I don't see that happening. One way or another, this war will have a victor, because none of the two sides seem to be willing to sort of back down. Unless they found some sort of common ground where both of them could compromise. Which, again, I don't see that happening because they have so different opinions. And I'm talking about the prime ministers mainly, Zelensky and Putin, because I'm pretty sure Russians and Ukrainians don't want the war.
On saying that, Putin's terrified of the defeat, although I think he would take negotiations where Zelensky could offer him some, land to annex, so he could go back with the victory of, say, Bakhmut. Again, this is just hypothetical. He goes to if he can get victory in the Bakhmut region, he goes back to his people with that victory and say that he does negotiate with Zelensky with some annexed territory.
But the thing is,
that would be a win. But,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, that would require Zelensky and the Ukrainians being willing to negotiate with him to give him that. And I'm not so sure that Zelensky and the Ukrainian military is going to give him that, because right now the Ukrainians have been saying publicly they don't feel the need to negotiate with Putin. I mean, while the attack on Kherson was actually stalling a bit due to the rain mudding down the forests, so transports were having to come into the open, where they were getting picked off by Russian artillery after being spotted by drones. The Ukrainian military is in the position of strength here, so it's not really that surprising that Zelensky doesn't feel like he has to negotiate with Putin. They might actually think that they can push the Russians out, so the negotiations seem at this stage quite unlikely.
Yeah. And the reason Putin started the war wasn't to gain more territory in Ukraine. It was to prevent the Ukraine from actually joining NATO. So, gaining a bit of, territory and then going back and saying, okay, we won. I don't think that's something that he wants, because if at the end of the day Ukraine joins NATO, then all of this has been for nothing.
I agree partially. Go ahead.
That's what I was about to say.
I agree partially that he definitely doesn't want Ukraine joining NATO. In fact, that was one of his stipulations early on when the campaign started going badly right from the start. One of the things he offered was Zelensky offered Putin was that he wouldn't join NATO. So he definitely doesn't want them joining NATO. That was why he effectively demilitarized Georgia, or rather just invaded it and invaded Georgia, because he didn't want them to become a member of NATO. There's a lot of reports coming out the Kremlin that he simply doesn't recognize Ukraine as an independent country, and he wants to go back to the old USSR where Ukraine was part of Russia, and he's been engaging in small conflicts one at a time. So back in 2014 when he took the Crimea, that he's been basically taking Ukrainian territory piece by piece by piece. And some are saying that he wants to go as far as to put Ukraine overall back into it, make it completely part of Russia. I would say that I think that's quite likely, because he really doesn't seem to recognize Ukrainians' independence, or with the way that he's demolishing its cities and even its right to exist.
Yeah, that's also a very accurate take and description.
Yeah, it would be better if there was just some kind of peace that could be settled. To be honest, beyond the Bakhmut maneuver, which I think Putin's banking a lot on this, I mean, there might be some strategic importance to it, or it could just be a propaganda victory. I can't really see beyond that. Honestly, I'm not sure how this is going to end other than negotiation, whether it's plausible or not, really. But the thing is, NATO are a little bit at fault here as well. And there's been arguments in the past that while the Warsaw Pact ended and the USSR broke up, NATO stayed around, in that the Russia after the USSR was somewhat a new country. Again, this is an argument that was put forward, but NATO still remained. NATO's entire purpose of existence was to be a protection against the USSR, so that when the USSR broke, NATO's enemy was gone. We had the UN and things, but NATO basically still stood in defense of what was now Russia. And again, this is just the argument put forward by NATO critics. Some are saying that NATO long-term had a hand in this, escalating the situation and creating the mentality that Putin now has. I'm not sure how far that goes, but one thing I would say is the war in Ukraine, while it causes a lot of issues, which is worsening the energy crisis with shortages and food shortages from the grain supplies. I mean, we've seen the negotiations break down over the ports and the destruction of them. I mean, there can be no denying it. I mean, hell, even the comic book storage boxes I buy are in short supply because of the war. Also, the suppliers claim, because of the papers in the boxes was imported from Ukraine, emphasizes even more why you would want peace between these two countries. While Putin doesn't, at the moment, seem interested in negotiations right now, probably because he knows he's not going to get what he wants from it, and neither do the Ukrainians, that doesn't really mean that other countries, like those who are NATO states, aren't actually benefiting from the war. I mean, we've seen it. I mean, being in the UK, how many times did Boris Johnson, first of all, positive PR, how many times did Boris Johnson, before his resignation, go over to Ukraine to take pictures with Zelensky to try and distract the public from, all of what was happening to him in relation to the parties and Chris Pincher?
Yeah.
Even Liz Truss and even Rishi Sunak's been taking some photos with Zelensky to give him 50 million. It just became the cause to distract from how unpopular you were back home. Biden, with all of his rhetoric, when he was facing the worst disapproval rating in history. But, I mean, do you remember the interview that we covered in an earlier video with Susanna Reid, where, more significantly, the war was being used to blame current problems on? Like, for example, when Johnson said that he wouldn't commit to public spending of any kind because he would have to fund the war on Ukraine, and Susanna Reid really didn't let him get away with that.
Yeah, remember that very well. So the thing is, the war certainly had its impact on various countries, on all the levels, but at the same time, this created an opportunity for governments around the world to pass measures that they wouldn't pass otherwise, using the war as an excuse. So I totally agree on that. So the problem is, apart from the personal agenda, most governments are incompetent, and this whole situation is being handled poorly, making the economy even worse. And I'm talking about the global level.
Yeah.
And we start seeing the consequences by various tax increase, especially with the energy crisis.
Yeah.
Everyone's being in fear of, winter.
Because I mean, there was an energy crisis before the Ukraine war, which is the Ukraine war made it even worse.
Yeah, and somehow magically, most of the private companies did record profits.
Yeah.
So how come from the one side there's an energy crisis, and on the other side, all the energy provider companies that are privatized make record profits? It's a bit suspicious, but that's a bit off topic, I think, for.
Oh, it's fine, because it's still something that's benefiting from the Ukrainian war.
Yeah, true.
Because the next one I was going to go into, to be honest, the media. Whenever there's a war, I mean, obviously this is, a dog goes wolf, it's very obvious to say. Whenever there's a war, one of the major industries that benefit from it and make a lot of money off of it is are the press and the mainstream media in general. Even YouTubers make a lot of money off the Ukrainian war. They get a lot of views off of analyzing it. It's something to talk about, it's something to cover. I still remember Sky News coverage where it was one of the male correspondents in Ukraine saying, "Oh, this is a magical atmosphere, it's very patriotic, honestly wonderful, it's very moving." And what the audience saw were bankers, bakers, ordinary people basically giving up their lives to pick up a rifle and go off to war. It was tragic and it was sad. And this guy is just completely up his own ass, because he's getting to cover what he sees as a wonderful moment. He's completely. It was a very good symbol of how it was a very good example, rather, of how journalists some journalists, not all, do feed off of this conflict because they know it makes them money, it gets them awards, it makes them famous by simply just being there and watching it happen. Even though, yeah, they are in some danger, of course.
I mean,
So,
I think like the first sort of big war, because wars have been happening all around the world for the past since forever, but this is the first big one that everyone actually got affected. But the difference is that this time there's
in a
social
while, yeah.
media.
Mm.
And the thing with that is that sometimes you get misinformation from verified sources, and sometimes you get accurate information from unknown sources, but really you cannot cross-check this information to know what's good or not. But at the end of the day, the big difference is that with this war, because of the social media, there's a lot more information in general. So
Yeah, and we've got a lot of independent journalists who do a lot
yes,
of journalism themselves, who challenge the media barons.
and this whole thing comes back to what you said earlier about using the war as an opportunity to pretty much make more money directly or indirectly, or promoting yourself. Like when you mentioned the independent and the non-independent journalists.
I mean, certainly some national radio stations have got a bit of notoriety for covering the Ukraine war for the past year, but the radio station Times Radio, their highest view count was highest audience rating was 300,000. And while there were some inappropriate moments from specific journalists on there while covering it, 300,000 is not that high in comparison to some YouTube channels who get way more foot traffic than that from a UK audience. There's some of them who get about 800,000 views a video.
Yeah.
And the analysis they do is way more in depth than anything you're going to get off of a Murdoch Empire station, or even just a mainstream media news station in general.
True. I think in general there's a trend that people don't trust the mainstream media, and they shouldn't, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there's an agenda, and the agenda obviously affects how you present the facts and how you analyze the facts, and what message you want to pass, most likely indirectly, as to whose side is to blame.
I mean, this is history, because it's the first war it's the first war to take place in Europe after World War II, and as you say, it's affecting everything globally. But there's another interest as well in the Ukrainian war. I mean, we are rushing through these topics because each topic we've mentioned, it could be like a 4-part video in itself. However, there is also an even bigger reason why countries like Britain and the US benefit from Russian tensions: money. As soon as tensions began, stocks and arms companies like Lockheed, Raytheon just shot up in value, as they always do whenever there's Russian-American tensions. American arms companies began immediately selling weapons to European and NATO countries like Germany, France, and Poland to reinforce their borders to the Ukraine itself. I'll give some examples here. Washington sent at the beginning of the war 6,500 Javelin anti-tank missile systems, which are made by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. The cost of each missile is about £66,000, and the reusable launchers are £85,000. Example number 2. Another boon for Raytheon came from the US decision to send 1,400 Stinger anti-aircraft missile launchers. The company's already been awarded $625 million contract to replenish the stocks. Example number 3. Ukraine has received 50 billion rounds of ammunition from the US, which likely benefited Olin, the US Army's largest small arms ammunition supplier. Britain's BAE Systems made 400,000 rounds of ammunition for Ukraine. The Milan anti-tank guided missiles provided by France and Italy, which are produced in a joint venture with Airbus and Leonardo. Lastly, Bales also manufactures the next generation light anti-tank weapons NLAW, which have become infamous in Ukraine for taking out Russian tanks. A shoulder-launched missile system loaded for its success in blowing up Russian tanks. The UK is giving Ukraine more than 5,000 of them. Assembled in Belfast, these are believed to cost 30,000 each. So there's a hell of a lot of money to be made whenever there's a conflict going on. It's just the trick is to keep it locked into the Flashpoint war zone, in this case in Ukraine, and to not let it get out. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about not wanting to escalate it into Europe, to not give them capabilities that they didn't have before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, war definitely provides opportunities. There's always going to be people who will try to take advantage of it and consider everything else as collateral damage.
I mean, hell, even after the missile landed in Poland, it's been it's coming up to a week. It'll be a week on Tuesday. Even after that missile landed in Poland, there are already sentiments of bordering countries to invest more in missile defense systems, which can be provided from arms companies, like the US-sponsored ones, or the likes of the US and British governments themselves. Point being, where there is war, there is a market, as long as this conflict is contained and limited to the Ukraine and restrained to what could be argued as a status of a flashpoint conflict. And that's, goes into what we were getting at earlier, which we can go into a bit more detail now. And this profiteering has to be balanced alongside the individual interests of countries, whilst also making sure the assistance, aid and weapon sales don't escalate things. For example, what we were saying earlier, Zelensky asked for long-range ground missile launchers, but the request was refused, as the MLRs, again, that can fire up to 185 miles, would give the Ukrainians the capability to fire into Russian territory from within their own border. The Polish also offered those 28 MiG-29 fighter jets that the Americans refused to give, most likely for the same reason. In addition to reducing the spillage of war into other countries in the form of airstrikes going off target, for example, the request to also secure Ukrainian airspace was also declined by NATO primarily, again for the reason it may provoke the Russians. Just to re-emphasize, if the Russians perceived or interpreted any of this as NATO using Ukraine as a proxy state to attack them, NATO may fear nuclear or other intense escalation from Russia from that perception.
I agree with that, yeah.
I mean, the assistance given to Ukraine is also coming in the form of money, drones, transport, and weapons, among other things. And really, this is it's enhancing the capability over giving them capabilities they didn't have before. The Ukrainians would be able to. Some people are saying again that the Ukrainians would have been able to do all of this without the aid that they were given. It's just made it more efficient for them.
I doubt it. Although, to be honest, I'm not sure what was Ukraine's economy and supplies before the war.
The supplies were decent, and the economy was quite strong in terms of its exports and imports. I think it's just more how incompetent the Russian military was. I mean, you had Fox News saying at the beginning of the war, these are Russia's best, and they weren't. They were kids who were unemployed, who had nowhere to sleep. And they were just armed because Putin at the time was, and still is, obsessed with the idea of the special operation. You do this charge to the capital, and people basically judge the war by Western standards. Putin doesn't give a the casualty rates for the Russian army are a lot higher than they are for Western armies in terms of being acceptable. So you have 4 or 5 echelons, and each echelon has a casualty threshold of 40% casualties before it shuts down and stays in position. You then look at those echelons, see which ones are making the advances, and then you give up on the ones that are failing, and then you reinforce the ones that are succeeding, and you do that all the way to the target, which in this case would have been Kyiv. While that worked in Georgia, it didn't work in Ukraine, just because the Ukrainian army, being a bit more experienced than the Russian soldiers being sent in, were able to withstand the surprise echelon attack and hold the line. I'm not sure whether they could have committed to Kherson, mind, but people will, this can be very debated. But I think the Ukrainian army would have not collapsed in the first month without the aid. They would have been able to hold out for a while, just because of how incompetent the Russian military has been.
Yeah, but what about all the different defense systems that Ukraine got from the other countries? Without them, would you reckon they would be able to stand to Russia the way they did?
I don't think for as long. And personally, I don't think they would have been able to commit to the Kherson counter-offensive. That's just me. I think what I said earlier, I stand by. All of these weapons enhance them greatly in terms of ground capability, and that's what's given them the edge. But I think a lot of credit also has to go to how incompetent the Russian army is, which has allowed smaller numbers of Ukrainians to deal with larger numbers of Russian forces.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also been a lot of, just to be clear about it, this is the time when their culture is being formed by legend. You've got Zelensky, the legendary president who donned a uniform and, fought the war and stood up to the Russian bear. We've got, how many officers have we heard of Ukrainian snipers killing them or capturing them? There was a famous Spetsnaz officer who was killed. The Butcher of Grozny was killed. They've gotten some big targets from the Russian army, and the fact that those commanders were on the ground to begin with personally supervised the military, told you how badly the Russian war effort was going.
Yeah, it's been quite intense is one way to say it, but yeah, war is never nice.
No, it's not. And it becomes even less nice when, again, you have people who are I mean, it's got to be a conflict of interest. Joe Biden's saying this war has to stop, yet he's making a lot of money from it, for all the countries.
He's making a lot of money, but I think at the same time, it also is costing him money, because
the energy crisis again affect
Yeah.
the global economy?
I think, honestly, that's one thing they didn't expect when this started. I think they didn't expect that Putin would start playing with gas and start cutting people off. And whoever sabotaged that pipeline, the Americans or the Russians, they didn't expect, I don't think they personally expected that it would get this bad at the start, if that makes sense. I mean,
Yeah,
look
but
at
now
Ge-
everything is like in a course, which doesn't seem to be easy to change.
I mean, look at the German government. Germany was very dependent on Russian gas. Look,
Yeah.
even Britain, while not as dependent as Germany, had access to Russian gas. Back during the George Bush Jr. days, Putin, while not wasn't exactly a best friend, he wasn't seen as with as much hostility as he became, the provider of gas to a lot of countries. And the gas was used to create good relationships with NATO. And now he's pulling it away, and it's causing a lot of damage because we now have to find substitutes for it. It's a mess, to be honest, and it's something that really more effort should have been to try and negotiate. Whether they could have negotiated with the Russians, I don't know. But it really does say something about the state of the world where on one hand you're advocating for peace, and the other hand you have companies in your name making so much money in shares, because I get what you're saying about losing a lot of money in terms of government funding, but it's also personal finances of the world leaders.
Oh yeah, the personal finances of the world leaders have never been better, I believe.
I really would like to see exactly who has shares in arms companies as well. In terms of government officials, but they'll be lobbying in relation to the arms deals in all governments. They'll be backhanders to the press for favourable stories and coverage. A lot of people will be making money on a personal level from this conflict.
Yeah, and we'll never actually hear about it.
And with that, the assistance given to the Ukraine, it comes in the form of money, drones, transportation, and weapons, among other things. And while this really is enhancing the Ukraine capability over giving them capabilities it didn't have before, sum up the podcast, this was a very brief overview and summary, but hopefully it just conveys just how complicated the situation really is. There's a lot that's been left out, for example, Ukraine wanting to join NATO and a debate on that. However, with this knowledge, it really shows just how the missiles landing in Poland may have caused Article 5 being triggered and may yet raise tension even more. Again, just to re-emphasize, look at Zelensky stating it was Russian and the world needs to stop them. Language designed to escalate Article 5 being triggered on behalf of Poland against Russia, only for it to be discovered it was a Ukrainian missile. I mean, in complete contrast to that missile landing and changing the tone of the international debate, of the international conversation, you literally had in contrast Rishi Sunak saying to the Westminster lobby, oh, Russia's a rogue state, they're the evil villain. I mean, which they are, but you've got to be careful with the language you use. I mean, you literally had the Westminster lobby clapping like seals hearing that because they were like, yay, intense rhetoric. But then when the missile landed, the British government shut the fuck up about it. I mean, there was just silence. And there was merely just a Twitter statement from Sunak saying, we're not going to comment until more information's coming out. The language was very diplomatic, which it should have been. All the rhetoric stopped because they couldn't afford to say anything which might provoke the situation. Even the Russians were basically staying silent aside from it wasn't us.
Yeah.
That's how tense this conflict has become.
It's tense, and it's nice to see that no one is actually overly cocky about it.
Yeah, I've got to say I was relieved the way it was handled.
Yeah.
The way everybody just said, don't say anything, let wait for information to come out. And the media became very silent on it as well after the initial landing. I don't know if you noticed.
They didn't have much of a choice.
No, they didn't. They covered it for a few hours on the Tuesday, and it was a breaking story. And I'm going to say I was watching Sky's coverage of it, and that coverage was actually quite balanced. They for once, they literally just said it could have been A, B, or C. Could have been the Russians doing it deliberately, could have been a Ukrainian missile accidentally landing from their defense system. They just covered all the angles of what it could have been. And then obviously the results came out. I think it was you who actually dropped it to us that the intel services in America had said initially it doesn't look as though it's a Russian missile at all. Then Poland's government basically said, after wanting to trigger Article 4, which was quite scary, Article 4 is a political meeting to seek political counsel from the rest of the NATO allies about what to do. Now, that's terrifying, but really it could have just been, can you help us investigate what happened here?
Yeah.
Type of thing. But I've got to say I was relieved to see the way it was handled, to see all the bravado shut down immediately because something serious happened from this conflict. And I guess what we could take away from the conversation we've had, because this conversation is very complicated, lots of things have been discussed. The point I would say is this conflict really needs to end before it does escalate and spill over into Europe, because there are some who would argue it almost did on Tuesday.
Yeah, and we're still waiting to see the full outcome of this. But yeah, it's really a tense situation at this point.
Hmm.
So that's all we can do, wait and see, because we still don't have all the facts down, and I don't know if we'll ever gonna get all the facts down.
And we, like I said earlier, I genuinely struggle to see how this conflict would end, especially with the way it currently is now. Remember, this war changes sometimes on a daily basis. At time of recording, you've got the Ukrainians about to, do their counteroffensive, try to do the counteroffensive on Bakhmut or withstand the Russian offensive on it. But today the Ukrainians look like they'll withstand it. And, they've got the victory at Kherson with the Russian army pulling out, but with the weather conditions coming in, the Ukrainians are going to suffer the same problems that the Russian military had. And that might tip the balance in the Russian military's favor. And this conflict could become a career where it just goes on and on. I can't see the Russians backing down anytime soon, at least not until Bakhmut's gone. Either they've won it or lost it. It's one of those situations where I don't feel confident making a call on it.
Yeah, me neither. Like I said, it's a wait and see scenario.
All I can say is I hope the war ends so people can stop dying.
Yeah.
That's all
Yeah,
I
I
can
hope
think
so
to say.
too. I really hope so too. So we can start seeing how we can recover from everything. First was COVID, now it's this. And I'm dreading to see what happens next.
It's the thing though, there always seems to be a crisis. But that would be that is going off topic, and that would be a podcast in itself.
All I'm gonna say is that governments seem to love crisis, but as you said, it's a whole different topic which we should possibly talk about in a separate podcast.
Just to make Jim's and I and my position clear on this as well, while we've tried to discuss this objectively, I think it's safe to say we both think that Russia is in the wrong on this. The war is unjustified, the tactics they've used completely unjustified. This was not in defense of Russia, this was just objective analysis. Like we both said, we hope the war ends so as few people die as possible.
Yeah.
And with that, thank you for listening. We hope you gained some insights into the conflict. If you agree or disagree, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Remember to hit the trinity of the like, share, and subscribe. And Jim and I will be doing some more podcasts on international topics as well. Jim, anything you want to add?
No, you pretty much said it all. But yeah, we will start covering more stuff in regards to like world news and world politics and world economy, if we think it's interesting to talk about. Because we, most often than not, we like conveying opinions that you don't usually hear online and a bit unfiltered as well. So yeah, if we find anything worth debating, talking about, we'll talk about it.
Yep. And with that, guys, it's not Christmas yet, but just in case we don't get anything released, have a Merry Christmas, or at least have a good November, or try to at least stay warm.
And be safe.
Bye, guys.
Bye bye.